Whew, we're getting balls deep in the theology of gender over here. In the past 10 minutes, we've bounced from notions of God as a female, to the nature of the Trinity, to Adam's hermaphroditic genitals, to God as the first transgender surgeon, to the Christian condemnation of homosexuality, and a dash of Calvinism there at the end. Did it feel a little jarring? I thought it did. So let's take a quick 15-second breather before going any deeper. You ready? Hit it. All right, we're back. Almost all the beliefs we discuss in this episode have their foundation in the book of Genesis. Beliefs about how the world was created, why humanity and nature function the way they do, and ultimately, who is this mysterious God behind the heavenly curtain driving the world forward. Lots of controversy, confusion, and sadly lots of hateful discrimination have found their justification in a misunderstanding of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. So, I felt it necessary to jump into the mess and help sort out at least a modicum of the confusion. First things first, almost all Hebrew scholars agree Genesis 1 is a poem that depicts God designing a world with defined boundaries between binary opposites, meaning you have light and darkness, heaven and earth, land and sea filled with birds and fish, day and night marked by the sun and the moon, and ultimately male and female created in God's image as both masculine and feminine. Quick note on God's gender, since talking about God as a woman tends to upset anyone who believes God is strictly our Father who art in heaven.
Where's our mother? What happened to our mom? What did he do to our mom? Something happened. Somewhere in heaven there's a porch with a dead lady under it, and I want this story. Somebody's got to check the trunk of God's car for bleach and rope and fibers. Well, how can we not have a mother? At least maybe God's divorced. Maybe he has an ex-wife. God's a single dad, and he's raising us alone, and we're praying like, and he's like, I'm trying, it's just me up here. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe your life is your time. This is our weekend with Dad. That's what life is your weekend. And then when you die, you go to Mom's house.
Earlier, Staley made a reference to a feminine Hebrew word for the Holy Spirit. The word is ruach, which means spirit, and is a feminine noun. However, it's important to note that the Jewish people thought of this term differently than Christians do, as the Jews had no word or concept for the Holy Trinity. It's not a biblical word, and there was no solid doctrine of the Trinity until around 300 years after Christ's death. So when the Jewish people used the term ruach, it was far more focused on God's creative force or energy within the world. Much like the feminine noun Sophia is wisdom personified to describe the way God created the world in the book of Proverbs. Furthermore, the first description of God's nature is actually that of a female. Genesis 1:2 says, "And the Spirit of God," which is ruach, again a feminine spirit, "hovered over the waters." The word hovered in the original Hebrew is rachaf, I don't know how you say that, but it is almost exclusively used as the term for the way a female bird incubates its egg by hovering or resting over them in a nest. The same word is found in Deuteronomy 32:11 in the midst of this exact same metaphor, saying, quote, "Like an eagle that rouses her chicks and hovers over her young, so God spreads his wings to take them up." So yes, the authors of Genesis always intended for God to be understood as both feminine and masculine and everything beyond that binary. Which brings us back to God's boundaries and binary opposites rooted in the creation story of Genesis. While I don't think Adam was a hermaphrodite who transcended the gender binary, as Staley suggested, it's only because I don't believe Adam was actually a real person at all, but rather a symbol for all life inspired by God. The noun Adam is also the masculine form of the word Adamah, which means ground or earth. In the book of Genesis, it's often rendered to mankind, and Eve's name is derived from the Hebrew word to breathe, which I can't pronounce in the actual Hebrew, but it's tied to the notion of a generative life force. So Adam and Eve are simply the recipe for all human existence. We need a material body formed from matter or earth and a life force animating us with energy. Lastly, we need companionship, both with other humans and with the divine to experience true wholeness. This is what the authors of Genesis desire to communicate, and not some kind of doctrine to govern our sex lives. I'm fairly convinced that not only is the story of Adam and Eve poetic fiction, but the first 11 chapters of Genesis, known as the primeval history, are completely mythological as well. Now, I use the term myth not to devalue Genesis, but simply to describe them as fictional stories that point to a broader, universal truth. Joseph Campbell and Richard Rohr, my theological men crushes, both say that a literal translation of anything tends to be the least valuable translation. I did a breakdown of the Bible in our 3rd episode with David Greco if you want to hear more on that. Anyway, the primeval history, or Genesis 1 through 11, are all mythical stories attempting to explain why God, people, and the world are the way that they are. They're beautiful stories and they have so much to teach us, but when taken literally, we kind of sound crazy and are subject to some pretty legitimate mockery such as this.
It starts out messed up in the beginning in the book of Genesis. In the beginning there was Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel got married. To who? Where did these mystery bitches come from? I like messing with Christians, but...
Me too, Eddie. Me too. There are 4 key stories in the primeval history. The first is Adam and Eve, second is Cain and Abel, third is Noah and the Ark, and the last is the Tower of Babel, and I bet most of you heard these if you grew up in church. I'll give an honorable mention to the brief reference of the Nephilim in Genesis 6, who were apparently the offspring of sons of God who had sex with daughters of man, and were essentially demigods like Maui from Moana, which is pretty cool, and yet pretty insane if you take the whole Bible literally, because that means you believe that there were once half God, half human people walking around, and if you believe that, it seems like transgender people should be relatively easy to accept because they're at least still 100% human. All of the stories in Genesis 1 through 11 are so crazy and so epic, and guess what? After Genesis 11 ends, there's no mention of them ever again in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Because all of a sudden in Genesis 12, Abraham, the father of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim religions, enters the picture, and the entire genre of Genesis switches from epic mythological tales about how nature, humanity, and society were formed to a biopic with an incredibly narrow focus on one man in one secluded region of the world. You don't have to be a Bible scholar to feel that massive shift. It's like you were watching Cosmos, and then someone suddenly turned on Seinfeld. Radically different genres, radically different perspectives. I believe the authors of Genesis 1 through 11 want to help the reader develop a necessary lens through which to understand God's character and our purpose as His people. They hope to describe a God who is concerned with our well-being, who establishes healthy boundaries, and then invites us to cross them only when we fully understand the reasoning behind those boundaries. In the New Testament, Jesus becomes the ultimate boundary crosser by literally transcending the divine human boundary, the law-sin boundary, and basically every cultural boundary established by religious leaders and Jewish tradition. Jesus only really makes sense if you understand the transformational arc of God's people, who went from only understanding God in terms of binary opposites to a people who could understand God as embodying all that is paradoxical, mysterious, and graceful. That's what I think Staley is trying to do, and I appreciate her so much for it. Whew, that was a lot. Again. Do you need 15 more seconds of rest before we finish the episode? You do, don't you? Okay. All right, hit it.